name's Kathleen Luckton. I'm the current coordinator of the West Kootenay Women's Association, and I want to welcome you to the 36th anniversary of the West Kootenay, of the Nelson and District Women's Center. Woohoo! 36 years is a long time. We have a fairly full and exciting day today, and it seems that we're running on Kootenay time. When I lived in Philadelphia, the Puerto Rican community called it Puerto Rican time. And when I worked in the African American community, they called it Black People's time. And here they call it Kootenay time. So I guess we're starting exactly on Kootenay time. Thank you for coming out. I would like to acknowledge first, before we go any further, that we are on Sinaiic's traditional land. And we have Lola Campbell, who is Chief Bob's daughter, who is here today to open our proceedings. And let me introduce you to Lola. Please come up. Thank you, Lola.
Why, everybody, on behalf of Bob Campbell, the Sinaiic Nation, I welcome you to our land. I'd like to just say a little prayer in my language to acknowledge the grandmothers in that here. So, first of all, I need to introduce myself. In Cha Isquis, Waini, Pwenu, Yayat, Ship Shippy. In Cha Sinaiic's, oh, my dad would not be proud. White Linen, Quillen, Shootin', Yaya, Tombs, Yaya, Hakaihin, Ha'o, Stimtimas. I'm here to just welcome. I'm welcoming all of our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmas, Tatupias, the ancestors that are guiding us, all the women in our family. We come from a maternal lineage, and all the power of the nation was bestowed upon the women of the nation, and the men were merely there to take care of us and our families. So it's a big honor, and I'm glad to be here. I'm kind of nervous. And I guess it's been a while since I spoke my language and had to do that, so it's good for me to practice like that. I pray in my head, but I don't speak it very often other than with my family, so I apologize for that. And I'd like to introduce myself to the panel. For the ones who don't know me, I'm Lola Campbell. My dad is Bob Campbell. My grandmother was Eva Orr. A lot of you know her. She passed away, and she's the reason why I'm here today in this valley, to reclaim our traditional lands and to make the ancestors and know that we're going to continue on, and our whole being is all around. What we do right now, up and on today, is to all for the next 7 generations. So your whole life is planned around the 7th generation. And the work that the women do, that it's really good to, you gotta have a strong women's society, because the tribe is only as strong as your weakest woman. If she's down, then the whole tribe will help her get back on her feet, and that's how you end up with a good society, and that's the way we have been taught. And so I'm glad to see all the faces, and I'm glad to know that there is a community and a district community center for the women, because I see with my own eyes a lot of suffering that goes on in other countries and in this one. And it's good to have that outreach, and I applaud you all for helping the women around this community. White Linden. And I said my name is Learned Everything About Buckskin. That's my baby name. And Toom is mother, Coconut is grandmother, and Tupa is great-grandmother, and Tatupia is after that.
Thank you, Lola. It's pretty appropriate when she's talking about 7 generations, because I don't think we have 7 generations quite from 1972, but we certainly have generations for the women that we're going to be honoring later on today. Not only are we going to be honoring the people who have put time and energy into the Nelson Women's Center, but also we're going to be honoring some of our elders and people who have put a lot of time and energy into making this a world a better place for us. I think I'm first going to introduce Marsha Brondi and then turn this part of it over to her because this will be the panel discussion. And this is something that she has organized. Marsha has been around and working with the Women's Center since the beginning in 1972. And she has also said that she was one of the women who started women's festivals in Canada. And she also has a few other hats as a doctor that she's worn, and I'm going to let her share with you those things which at the moment I've just forgotten. So I want to say welcome to everybody and everyone who is here. I'm glad you could come out. And Marsha, I'm turning it over to you for now. Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm really glad to see everybody who's here today. How's the sound? Works, okay. This panel is a wonderful thing to have put together. We're really fortunate to have in this panel the very first coordinator of the Women's Center. With whom I worked in 1972 and 1973. And I think that I have just a couple of announcements about the timeline that you see on the wall around you. If you want to, we certainly encourage you to walk behind the tables so that you can read the timelines. And if you see anywhere on the timeline where you think there's a mistake, I really would like you to take a pen and correct it or add a comment. The boards are free for everybody, and the research is not always accurate, and I really welcome everybody's contribution. At 4:30 this morning, I reached the year 2000. And so you see on this end a lot of blank space, and anybody who is here tonight probably has a fair bit of experience between now and the year 2000. And so they should really feel free to make little comments about things that they're aware of that happened during those times. I want to thank all of the panel members for being here, and I'm going to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. I may say a word or two just because I know them and love them, but it's up to them. And so I'd like to start with Vita Story, who you'll see from the first probably 10 years of the timeline in the back has been involved not just with the Women's Center, but with the Women's Access at Selkirk College and a number of other things which she'll talk about. Yes, please.
Okay, just a little correction. My name now actually is Vita Luthmers, formerly known as Vita Story. So, yeah, it's just wonderful to be back here to see some new faces and to see all these wonderful old faces, not old, but from the past faces, and to be here again after all these years. I never did lose my connection with the Kootenays because I would come back every so often. I have been living down in the United States for 23 years and have recently moved back in September and back to my house in Squirrel Creek, so it feels like I've come home again. And so this is a nice way to just see everyone and get back in touch with what I did many years ago, which started, the Women's Center actually started in 1972. We there was a group of us who were working on what was then known as the Local Initiatives Program. And this was during the era of the Trudeau government. They were trying to develop progressive programs in communities and trying to interest young people in, being involved and active in their communities. And this was just after the Royal Commission report on the status of women. So the Local Initiatives Program was set up in Nelson in order to look at the needs of adult education. And so there was two of us that worked on that program, and Julie Curtis and myself. And we decided that we wanted to look at the needs of women because we had an office set up at Baker and Ward. It was that, that KWC block building, and we had an office set upstairs there with those nice rounded windows, that a great vantage point for watching parades. So that was the extra benefit of having being up there. But actually, before we even got the Women's Center, in 1972, still on the Local Initiatives Program, we met in homes. There was Maureen Argatoff, who was involved, and we often used her living room, and we started having consciousness-raising groups. And these were groups that would get together, we'd advertise them, and we'd talk about, a lot of it had to deal with health issues. Back in the 70s, nobody knew where to get an abortion. Who was the doctor that was going to be open to referring you for an abortion? Nobody really knew a lot about birth control or about, it was just something that was not available on a very wide scale. It was sort of a private thing you and your doctor talked about, but we kind of wanted to do some surveys and figure out what were the needs of women in the community with regards to health issues. So we did a health questionnaire sent out to all doctors, and we identified doctors who would be open to getting referrals for abortion, birth control. There was a lot of, that's sort of how we started, was with the health issues. And we applied for a grant. After the Local Initiatives Program ran out of money or terminated, we applied for a grant from the Secretary of State. And we received initially $7,600. I remember that figure because I thought, wow, this is great. And we got that money from the Secretary of State, and we opened up an office. And there was, I'm trying to remember who the other coordinator was at the time. The little gray cells just don't work not well anymore. And I didn't go back in my files, but Camille was not there. She came later. But anyway, there were two of us working there. Maybe it was Julia Curtis. I think it was Julia, yeah, and she eventually left and moved to Vancouver, and then Marcia came. But so we decided that women needed a drop-in center. They needed a place to come, and we set up a resource library. We had information about employment. We had information about the health center. It was basically a drop-in center for all women, and we had to we had a kind of a weird landlord. He one day we came to work and he had locked all the doors on us, and we couldn't get up to our center. And I remember thinking, well, what's going on here? And it turned out that he felt that there were too many strange women wearing work boots. And he thought that was too odd and confusing for people to handle. So he didn't think, and he took all our signs away. And so I had to go and talk to him and say, we're here legitimately. Just get used to the work boots. They're not going away. So anyway, I could go on and on with little stories and vignettes, but we have to give everybody a chance. So anyway, the center stayed in the KWC block until about, I think it was like till the mid-70s, and then we moved to the jam factory. But it was, yeah, I think we were the start of a lot of really positive groups in Nelson that had to do with human rights issues, poverty issues, employment issues, health issues, and they're all still going on. And so it's really great to see something that was started so long ago is still here and still just wonderfully evolving, and everybody's committed to keeping it going, because we did have our really hard times where we ran out of money. We didn't think we'd be able to continue. And every time something would happen and the money would come. So there we go.
Thanks, Julia. I'll just do a very brief description of some of the work that when I came into the Women's Center, I was working on the health research project where we interviewed all of the doctors. We sent all of the doctors in town a questionnaire to find out their feelings about abortion. And we asked women who their doctors were and how they felt about their doctors, and we basically collated that information and made it available to women who came into the center. That was a big piece. But one of the things that we discovered was that there was a fair bit of ED going around, and the Selkirk Health Unit decided that was not the case. Of course, there was no VD here because what was happening is that the women would go in and get tested, but they would send the cultures to Vancouver, and it would die on the way. And it took us, I think, close to 4 years to actually get a VD testing facility culture at the Kootenay Lake District, get the laboratory at the Kootenay Lake District Hospital to do the culturing so that it didn't go to Vancouver and die on the way. And that made a very significant difference, I think, in terms of women getting health, and men as well. One of the things that I did while I was at the Nelson Women's Center and involved with a group called the Kootenay Women's Council, which were representatives from Trail, Castlegar, the Spokane Valley Women's Group, the Trail Status of Women, women from all over New Denver. There were representatives on the council from quite a lot of areas. It was really a time of, well, the Status of Women report, the Royal Commission report had come out, and a lot of women in the country were starting to talk about the issues in that and other issues as well. And we were producing a newsletter that I'm not sure whether, did the Women's Center start the newsletter, and then I took it over to the images. Well, it wasn't images then, it was just a newsletter. I went through all of the early images, and it wasn't until I think I named the date on the timeline when in fact it did get named. Somebody suggested images, and we named it that. It was an 8.5 by 11 Gazette Nerd publication for the first several years. And finally I decided to, as the editor, I would put it into newsprint. And I had the great good fortune of working with a woman whose name was Bubbles Hodgson from Trail. Just a magnificent woman whose husband worked at Cominco, and she had time, and she was an older woman. She was, I think, 10 or 12 years older than me. And it was just a pleasure to work with her, to talk with her, to chew things over, because her perspective was always quite different from mine, and we learned a lot from each other. Ultimately, you know, she was Image's first typesetter, and then I got PID, organizing the Western Canadian Women's Festival, and I gave the job of editing images to mow lions. And she did it for a year, and you'll hear from her here. She can't be with us today, but we do have her as a video. And she turned images into a collective. And I think we all owe her a deep gratitude, for that. And I think one thing I'd like to ask is all the women in the room who ever worked on images, please stand up. And I'd like to give a special mention to Bonnie Baker, who lived with it for a long time till its demise, I think, in 1993. 91? Well, Well, it lasted for almost 20 years, so it was the longest running women's newspaper in Canada. And now, I'd like to hand it over to Diane Luckton, who is the person who took up the cudgel. Could somebody pass the mic down? Thank you.
Hello, well, I'm glad to be here too. And I was glad, I had worked before, starting in 1970, we had a women's discussion group through adult education, and just managed to have and identified a bunch of the same issues you people did. And I was, and I had worked in family daycare up until then. My kids were in school and been around the Women's Center, but was so delighted to be able to get more involved. And what year was that again? I don't know.
I believe you took it, it was 75 or...
Maybe 4, but...
Yeah, 74, yeah.
Whatever it was a lot still was focused on healthcare issues. And besides all the hard work had done for which doctors were good for what and which doctors were preparable for what, we also took out birthing issues, because there was no rooming in allowed, there were no partners allowed in the birthing delivery rooms. The doctors would say no, that the fathers will get upset and faint, and you can't have rooming in because the baby could wake up the other mothers. And that was a long discussion that we had with them, and were very successful. And now it's almost impossible to believe that that had to be a long, more than 2 or 3 year, maybe 4 year discussion. It was the same on the testing for sexually transmitted diseases. And we had our local health officer was not friendly, and I remember Callie and Callie would go and work with him, and so Callie Wosley and I shared that coordination, and we would role play. I would role play that jerk, that was in charge and saying no, and she would role play going in to talk to him. And we did a lot of that stuff to support each other so that we knew how to handle the bureaucracy. Then we found in a fellow that turned out to be the regional health officer, Blatherwick, an ally. And that was partly how we were managed finally to get testing done at the hospital. And I don't know of the status of what lab testing they do here now or anything like that. So birthing was a big issue. What other doctors? There was also a time where the NDP came into power and community resource boards came into power. And truly they did, because all of a sudden, instead of fighting for farther away places for funding, we had the opportunity to fight for it on a more local basis. And we wanted a healthcare worker, and that was Camille Bush. She was a midwife, and so women could come in with various questions, and Carolyn DeMarco also helped out during that time. And I remember us sitting at the Community Resource Board that was a little bit nervous about what was really going on at the Women's Center at that board, and packing the aisleways. We couldn't even get in, all of us, to the meeting, and sitting. There were so many of us sitting in all the aisleways while they made the decision if they would fund our healthcare worker or not. So by then we had gotten fairly organized around those issues, and were fairly effective. There also was legal work being done. There was about Justice Development Committee set up. And I remember I was, as a paid functionary, thought yes, and the board thought that would be good, or the collective, to get involved in that, and having to really worm our way into that so that women's health, women's legal issues could be considered. And one outcome of that was we had no protocol for rape at all. And so then we came and worked with a committee to set up a rape crisis line, and that ran out of the Women's Center for a long time. We worked with the police that had no protocol, and we worked with the hospital that had no protocol. And it was a tremendous amount of work and energy, and a very interesting experience for me and the women involved with that. The other thing we did was try to build up our general resources. And so we got various grants for library books, and we got a pretty good beginning library for the Women's Center. And then at some point when we would apply again and again, and they finally said, well, if we went in the public library. So we had a big section in the city public library of women's resource books that we fundraised for. There's lots of very fun things, and lots of women's festivals. We would, the status of women in the teachers group got going, and so when they would have their pro-development days, we would ask to go and speak, and at first they'd say no, and so we would just go to all of the discussions that were pertaining to women and make sure that what we felt was a good women's point of view was heard in that discussions. And SPARC, which is the Social Planning and Review Council, had a big healthcare conference here, and we also packed that one. So we would have at least 3 or 4 women in every workshop that had any discussion about women going on that we could find out about. And so it was kind of exciting there. That was BCTF. For me personally, and it's always, we were big on, political is personal, personal is political, right? But one of the people I remember the most for helping me, because I didn't know how to write a government grant, Vita and Marcia were busy with other endeavors and said, there's money there for funding, but you guys have to go for it. And so I called Maureen Argatoff and became dear, dear friends with Maureen over many struggles in the community at large. But it helped through that point because I didn't know how to talk to the Secretary of State. But I think that's just a brief overview because I don't want to take, I probably used my 5 minutes. And, I don't even remember who came after me, but I do remember there's NBC.
Yes, we are missing a couple of people. So there's a couple, I believe one of them just came in the room. Anyway, Rita, we're going to bypass a few years and head right into, what year is it we're talking about, Rita?
Mid-80s.
The mid-80s.
Hi, I'm Rita Moyer. I was not ever a coordinator at the Women's Center, although I moved here in 1975 from Lethbridge, Alberta, the deep south. And I worked at the Women's Center there in the early 1970s and at the first birth control center in Lethbridge, if you can imagine. The deep heart of Mormon country. So it's really, you can see that our earliest issues were really healthcare issues. Our bodies ourselves had come out. I think I still have a speculum in a drawer somewhere. We all were examining each other all over the place. But I became very involved in the pro-choice movement. And in the mid-80s, that was a huge battle here because every hospital board had the right to decide whether or not abortions could be permitted in that hospital. And this was a very big battle in Nelson between the Nelson Right to Life group and the the pro-choice group. Just before I get really started, I want to thank very much the Nelson Museum because I was also a reporter at the time, and I had a whole box of materials, my private notes, newspaper clippings, and the kind of thing that you can't give away because you become such a burden in your home to have these big boxes of history. The Nelson Museum took them, sorted them into files, thinks this is a very important era, and doesn't have a lot of material from it. So I was very lucky that I could phone them and say, can I have that box back? And they gave it back to me organized. But there were a couple major events that happened, and I'm also important that we learned is coalitions with women who we might not normally think that we would have a coalition with. And one of those groups was the hospital auxiliaries. These women had worked forever, very, very hard for the hospital. In 1985, Jim Demers, who still lives in Nelson, walked into the Nelson Hospital, which had very little security at the time, took the vacuum aspirator, which was used for performing abortions, rolled it out, and brought it back later and changed it into something else. This deeply, deeply offended the hospital auxiliaries. We feminists created a coalition with the hospital auxiliary. Sam Simpson and I joined the South Spokane Hospital Auxiliary and helped out with many a bake sale. But those older women were our allies because they knew what it meant for women to be butchered in backstreet abortions. These were not women who spent all of their time crocheting doilies. These were women who had, I mean, that's a good thing to do, but they had many political interests and they were interested in forming a coalition with us. We organized so hard because we had to sell memberships in the hospital, to become a member of the hospital, to vote at the board meetings, you had to become a member. There are piles of notes in there of everybody we put forward to become a hospital board member on the board itself, what their politics were, who they were related to, how we could talk to them, notes and notes and notes and notes. So we had, one of the biggest meetings was 500 people at the Nelson Arena. 500 people, and we voted in a pro-choice board, because at that point, if you didn't have a pro-choice board, there were no abortions performed. Some of the other things we did, we had a huge, this is 400-name petition, powered by choice, in the Nelson Daily News. 400 people paid for this ad. And we also had, Betty Daniel is in this picture, and we had many, a demonstration. This was when the Nelson pro-choice, anti-choice group put out a very lurid pamphlet of dead fetuses that went into every mailbox in Nelson. And it was not enclosed in an envelope or anything like that. And we fought that, and Canada Post eventually changed its policy. At that time, Joe Borowski, who was the big national anti-choice campaigner, came to Nelson to help raise funds for Jim Demers. I could go on and on, but it was an incredible time. And just to go back to the hospital auxiliaries, those women were so offended by what had happened to their hospital and how one issue group was trying to take it over. Their credibility helped so much, and eventually we also got the hospital boundaries expanded into the Spokane Valley because those women were not allowed to be members of the Nelson Hospital, the organization. So there were many struggles at that time, but we worked lists. There were 3 of us in particular, Sandra Lane and Sam Simpson and I, and many people in this room too, but we worked our tails off, and we did not leave one detail uncovered. However, interestingly, after 400 people paid for this ad, many people wouldn't join up. They wouldn't pay the $5 membership because they sort of had enough. They were tired of it. Nelson Right to Life skunked us and took over the board again, so we had to fight the whole thing over. So it just doesn't end. I mean, we fought those battles, and now women do have the right to choice, but it came on the backs of a lot of women and men working in coalition. So thank you very much.
Maggie Haley. Maggie Haley is going to talk about Women Works.
Women Works was a project, so we're moving from health issues, which were a dominant focus, certainly for the Women's Center. And when I moved to the Kootenays to Nelson in the mid-80s, and part of the reason I moved here was because of the strength of the women's movement, having come from Eastern Canada, been part of one of the first transition houses in Nova Scotia, having worked in a women's shelter in Calgary prior to moving here. It was an easy place and a comfortable place to move into. The Women's Association, I'm sure prior to 1986, or I'm sure in 85, and Sally probably knows better than I, started working on grants with Marcia and I wondered this morning, was it what we call now Services Canada or HRBC, or, but now I'm
Employment
thinking,
and Immigration Canada, I think.
but I think Secretary of State Women's Programs was also part of the funding of Women Works. So the collective at the time put together the grant proposal, and we got the funding, and so there's more of a focus on employment. And the terminology of the day for the program, the intent was for it to be for disadvantaged women. And we would have great discussion, what did disadvantaged, I mean, it wasn't too much of a stretch to figure out what disadvantaged was. It was, the intent was for women who'd been out of the workforce for whatever reason, for raising children, for just lack of training, education, skills. The program was a 16-week-long program, and women would spend that long a time in a classroom. There were 3 of us working for Women Works, Joan Sylvie, Heather Gibson, before her, Ann McMillan, Heather Gibson, and myself. Joan Sylvie and I spent a summer developing the content or material that we were going to deliver or speak with the women about, and we were directed to infuse a feminist content, which was probably one of the more unique parts of a women's employment program. So the women would spend, and we moved into the medical arts building. We had which is a beautiful building, great view for parades on Baker and M Ward. And the women would spend 16 weeks with us in the classroom, and then 16 weeks we would find, and they would find and make choices of places they want to work in the community, whether it was businesses, nonprofits. And there was a big emphasis on what we call then non-traditional trades and work. And we'd have women from the community, and I see a number of them in this audience, that would come in who were journeyman carpenters, Marcia being one of them, and other women ambulance, first responders, that just a whole myriad of trades, reporters, writers, that kind of thing, come in and talk with the women. The women came from all walks of life, and so for 16 weeks we would support them out in workplaces, and I think over the course of, it ran from 1986 to 1989, there were over about 110 women who went through the program. I've seen many of them over the years in the community, and we forged very close connections. They forged close connections with one another, which of course is a great part of doing that kind of program in a group. The issues were very similar, I'm sure, that from the past then that they are even right now, and of course poverty was a huge issue for women. Relational issues, emotional, mental distress issues, health issues, absolutely. But employment was a big one, and women, so living in substandard housing, not being able to afford a decent standard of quality of life. And that was the whole intent of the program, was to support women to improve that for themselves. The strength of the program, one of the unique things was that any employment programs up to that point had been either women were on assistance or were paid a stipend. We insisted that women were paid a wage, and it was a wage higher than minimum wage at that time. The length of the program really helped women because they felt really supported over the long term. And of course, having the support of the collective was amazing for women. And we introduced women to a lot of concepts and ideas that they hadn't had given a lot of thought to, hadn't been exposed to, might have rejected outright in the past, and some women warmed to that, and we learned a lot from them. It truly was an amazing program. We had an external audit or review in 1989, and it came out with a very positive outcome. However, government being what it is, it ended in 1989. But I think the success carries on in the women who had that experience. It was certainly a success and quite an experience for us who worked in it, just in terms of, and some people have mentioned around grant writing. Every year we would have to reapply for funding, of course. And we were early pioneers in computers. One of our group rooms, we had computers and introduced all the women in the program with the old DOS systems, and they were quite archaic at the time. But that was also quite an exciting feature of the program. I don't know, there's so many things to say about Women Works, and I just feel really grateful I was part of it. And my daughter here, who is now 20, was part of it because she was in gestation and working with women. It was wonderful to be able to have babies and breastfeed while we worked.
Hi, I was the Women's Center coordinator from apparently 1985 to 1987 to 1990. I had to check on those dates. They didn't come readily in my mind. And there's a big gap between Diane Lupton and me. It's about 10 years there. And during that time, there's the list. When I came into the position, I followed Carol Beauchamp-Ross, and there was a lot of things in place that were rolling along. The Women's Festival was happening every summer. There was a strong volunteer corps that organized that. There was International Women's Day activities that were organized every year, and there was Take Back the Night events. While the one thing that has become an annual event that took place during the time I was there is the massacre in Montreal. Took place during that period, and as we were all sort of reeling from it and sort of looking at each other and trying to think how to respond, Jane Steed came into the center and said, "We have to do something. We have to do something now," and was, instrumental in nudging me into, and she did a lot of the organizing, and we held the first memorial that year. What I remember most clearly about my time there is that we moved, and we moved, and we moved. After many years at the Jam Factory, a big stone building down there, we were given our eviction notice so that H&R Blocks could expand. And we moved. It was a hard time. We couldn't find very good quarters. We ended up down on Front Street in a dark, dank, dismal and damp location. Every time it rained heavily, the toilet overflowed. The sump pump rumble, I don't remember that, but it was not a good time. And people had to cross Front Street. I always had this vision of this young woman with her baby in a stroller, running across Front Street to get to us because there was no crosswalks on Front Street in that area. But we moved there, we survived there, and then we moved up to Hall Street, above Jarek Cycle, which the co-op was there then. Which, although the access still wasn't great, women with babies and strollers still had a very long stairway to get up. At least it was bright and light and closer to downtown, and was an improvement. The year we were down on Front Street in the dismal place, I remember Penny Bonnet working, it seemed like full-time, looking for funding. We had struck a committee before we left Vernon Street, and we had a special general meeting and approved getting a mortgage. We could find a building. And Penny spent that whole winter, it seemed like, researching funding sources, trying to find someone to give us money to provide enough of a down payment that we could actually buy a facility. And several, so then we actually moved to Hall Street. Nothing came of it for a few years. After, I wasn't the Women's Center coordinator anymore, but one of the big involvements I had, one of the things that's still dear to my heart is we managed to actually buy the house on Mill Street. And we found money to do the renovations by getting a training grant. And we hired Jane Barker and Catherine Fisher and Grace Scott. Thank you.
And Sally McKenzie.
I was the person doing the training, and we hired those other women as trainees, and then Grace didn't finish the project. Cher Knox took her place towards the end, and we totally gutted the downstairs of that house, and we just took it right back to the outside walls, which was a wonderful experience because it was 100 years old, and there was things behind the walls, newspapers and razor blades and bits of this and that. And so we managed to get an extension on that project so that we were actually able to finish it We, finished laying the carpets and did a few bit of trim boards, as people were wheeling the filing cabinets in the back, in the front door. My sister Suzanne and Maggie Shirley and Pat Griffiths and I were the housing committee during the time of the renovation, and I remember we used to meet weekly at it's the New China restaurant now, it wasn't then. Pardon? Shamrock, yes, we used to have breakfast meetings there. And, discuss where we were and what had to happen in the next week and what decisions we needed to make. And, the house eventually became the G. Mackenzie House, named after my mother, in recognition of, I think, the whole Mackenzie family's contribution, but in recognition of her, activities in the community and participation. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the other big change in the time that I was actually the coordinator is that we got operational funding. We had been operating on Secretary of State project grants from the time that, I don't know when the first one happened, but for a long time, 1973. And those grants were given to us to do specific projects, not to operate the Women's Center, not to have a drop-in, not to provide the support and the counseling and things that we provided at the Women's Center, but to do specific projects. So in addition to running the Women's Center out of that money, we also had to, every year, and it's not like there was any shortage of work we wanted to do, but we had to come up with other projects of research or specific advocacy, things like that that we wanted to do. And so in the time that I was the coordinator, I was very involved with the BC and Yukon Women's Centers Association, and we had an NDP government again. And the Ministry of Women's Equality with Penny Pretty, we negotiated with her, and they gave us operational funding so that we finally had money to do the work the Women's Center had always done, as well as money to do the advocacy and lobbying and research that we also do. So those were the two big things. I actually quit my job at the Women's Center so that I could work with BC and Yukon Association Women's Centers, which was, of course, not a paid position. But you know how that goes. So, that's my story.
Hey, Linda Keeley, the Women's Center has one of the most amazing feminist libraries anywhere. We have our own library that we have developed over all of the years. And in fact, Kathleen Shannon, who was the executive producer of Studio D at the National Film Board, who retired here, died and left us her book collection as well.
As did Sally's sister, Suzanne.
Thank you. And guess who's been having the job of taking care of our library all that time?
So I got involved with the Women's Center Library Committee in 1990 when I moved to town and passed on that job to Sandra Hartline last year after looking for a replacement for myself for about 5 years. 17 years of one volunteer commitment for somebody who likes to start things and not carry them out. It was being character building. And I'm really grateful to Sandra for taking over because as most people who know me, I have more character than I need. So I worked at the Women's Center from about 1997 to the year 2000. My co-workers were Mo Lyons and Karen Newmoon through most of that time. It was a bit of a golden era because we had the new house. In between, the NDP had gone out of power. We had kept our operational funding during that time, but the NDP came back in and money was more plentiful than it had ever been, I think, in the history of the Women's Center, and has been since. So it was really an era in which, we had no illusions, not 3 full-time staff. I think we had the equivalent of 1.5, which was far better than ever before. However, interestingly enough, the same issues for women persist all through that time: poverty, housing, violence, transportation, employment equity. The capitalist patriarchal norm just continues on regardless of how much funding we get. And it was an era in which we ran a lot of groups, we participated in a lot of committees, and I think Karen and Mo's interviews on that will talk a bit more about that. I was more involved at the administrative end of things. The house was great, yeah, and we kept doing things to it during that time. The thing that's interesting about the house is that I think Mark Wood might have taken off where Penny left off, or there was a committee that kept fundraising because the dream was to pay the house off. So in the early 2000s, the house, we bought the mortgage out. The Women's Centre still has a loan to some private investors, a small loan, but basically the house has no liens on it. It belongs to our community. That coincided with a period in which we lost our operational funding. So we're oddly an organization with massive assets